Peace, family. It's Bakari Lumumba back once again, the progenitor of lumumbaspeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we can gain a competitive advantage as Black people globally by always betting on Black. Back with another video, but before we begin, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button, and please feel free to share. Hope you all are having a wonderful holiday season as we wrap up 2021, a tumultuous year where we've dealt with a number of different issues. But I'm here to discuss a issue that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is, why do I celebrate Kwanzaa? I've got a lot of questions about this for the past couple of weeks, and of course, I've even had people ask me, what is Kwanzaa? So before I discuss why I celebrate Kwanzaa, I'm going to first discuss what Kwanzaa is not before I discuss what Kwanzaa is. So first and foremost, I think it's very important that we understand that Kwanzaa is not a religious or heroic holiday. So what do I mean by that? Many people have a belief that Kwanzaa is somehow tied to, of course, Islam, which it is not, or that it is a Black Christmas, which it is not. Also, I think it's very important to understand that Kwanzaa is not an African holiday. Kwanzaa is the African-inspired holiday. And what do I mean by African-inspired? I mean, it is a holiday that is inspired based on our culture, history, and heritage as a people of African descent, just like we have African-inspired religions, such as Rastafari, Santeria, and of course Voodoo or Badoon, based on the pronunciation that you like to use. Also, I think it's very important that we understand that Kwanzaa is not a heroic holiday, meaning there is no celebration of any one particular individual. Kwanzaa simply is a African-American and Pan-African holiday that celebrates the best of what it means or what it is to be African and human in the fullest sense, right? And so in doing so, we want to celebrate what it means to be Black. What does it mean to be a person of African descent? And celebrate, the best of our culture, right? We understand that oftentimes here in the death and decadence of the Western diaspora, we deal with a omnipresent threat of anti-Black racism, particularly in education and the media, where the images and perspectives of Black people and Black life and culture are seen as very negative and self-defeating and self-destructive. And to counteract that, I think that's one of the reasons why Kwanzaa was created. I think it's also important to understand some of the historical and cultural background that led to the creation of Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa was created back in 1966 by the US organization. Many people would argue that the US organization, particularly Black Panther sympathizers, would argue that the US organization meant US stood for United Slaves. That is simply not true. However, there was a unfortunate rift between the US organization and the Black Panther Party, as the Black Panther Party, as we all know, were Black Marxist organization. Then, of course, the US organization was a Black cultural nationalist organization that believed in what one of the things that Malcolm X stated, which was that we needed to have a cultural revolution before we have a political one. And Malcolm said that one of the biggest mistakes of the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement that took place in the 1950s and 60s, was that we sought to energize and mobilize people without waking them up and teaching them about who they were, and teaching them to love themselves. And as a result, we sought to change how white people felt about us before first and foremost changing how we felt about ourselves. And so the US organization, under the leadership of Dr. Malana Karinga, believed in that, and so they focused on Black cultural nationalism and Black people restoring in a Sankofa type of mindset the best of what it is to be African, in terms of restoring those cultural traditions, unfortunately many of which were lost during the Holocaust of enslavement. I also think it's important to put to bed some oftentimes some misinformation that's being promoted about Kwanzaa in the US organization. First and foremost, many people would argue that Kwanzaa was created by COINTELPRO, and that's the counterintelligence program against Black nationalist organizations during the Civil Rights and Black Power movement, under the leadership and behest of course, J. Edgar Hoover. First and foremost, that is false. There's no way, shape, or form that the United States government will create a holiday that taught people to unify, to practice agency, to work together, to develop their own economic industry and control of their own industries, and believe that their purpose in life was to restore themselves to their traditional greatness. There's no reason, way, shape, or form that the United States government would do something like that. Secondly, there's an argument that the US organization, of course, Dr. Karinga, were agents due to the unfortunate shootout that took place at UCLA, also known as University of California, Los Angeles, in January of 1969, that cost the lives of two Black Panther members, Johnny Huggins, and of course, Bunchy Carter. Unfortunately, the rift between the Black Panther Party and the US organization was once again due to COINTELPRO. There were letters being sent to both sides stating that, we were going to kill you, we're going to get you, we're going to shoot you, so on and so forth. This was a beef that was actually oftentimes exacerbated by the FBI. That led to the shootout. Even Geronimo Pratt stated that what took place was due to COINTELPRO and that neither side were actually working for the powers that be. So I think it's very important that we understand that. But I think one of the biggest issues many people have when discussing Kwanzaa and why they don't celebrate and one of the pushbacks that they have is due to, of course, Dr. Malana Karenga being convicted in 1971 of assault, torture, and, of course, false imprisonment. Unfortunately, in the US organization was disintegrated after his imprisonment. They believed that there were 2 Black women who were agents, which they were not. They were tortured and assaulted, and as a result, he was found guilty. Now, court records and transcripts show that he was not present at the time of this taking place, but of course, this was his organization, and as a leader of the organization, he was responsible for what took place in the organization. He did 5 years in prison, got out, and in 1976 received a PhD in political science, and then in 1994, I believe he received a PhD in Egyptology. But be that as it may, I think it's very important that we understand that Kwanzaa is not a celebration of Dr. Malana Karenga. When I gather with my family and my children and we celebrate Kwanzaa, he's not even mentioned, right? Because it's not a heroic holiday, nor is it a religious holiday. It's a celebration of family, community, and culture. So with that being said, I'm going to get into why I celebrate Kwanzaa. First and foremost, grew up in Dayton, Ohio. Shout out to the Gym City, the 937. In the inner city, West Dayton strong, particularly in the neighborhood of Dayton View, USA all day. And so I went to majority Black, or we could even say all Black, elementary school, middle school, and high school. And I never learned about Kwanzaa. And of course, when I went to college, PWI, I learned about Kwanzaa. They had a pre-Kwanzaa celebration. And of course, many people may be questioning, what is a PWI or HWI, predominantly white institution or solely white institution? And one of the major issues was that many people said, well, if you go to an HBCU, you don't learn about Kwanzaa. But if you go to a PWI or HWI, you do. And I think there's a reason for that. Typically, first and foremost, most historically white institutions have to promote culture programming for their students of color. If not, it could be considered a unhealthy or toxic learning environment. They could be subject to lawsuits. Secondly, we have to understand that oftentimes with HBCUs, especially HBCUs that receive private funding, they've received this funding from white philanthropists, and the last thing many white philanthropists would want is a type of culture programming that would be the impetus for Black people to gain knowledge of self, love of self, and then rise up and have a rejection of course, white hegemony, not only at the academic level, but possibly nationwide and globally as well. Because we know that when we study the history of slave revolts, it was African cultural retention that was the impetus for slave revolts, right? If you don't believe me, there's a number of different books you could read about this. Frederick Douglass's narrative talks about this. C.L. James's book on the Haitian Revolution talks about this. There's even a great book by NYU professor by the name of Michael Gomez, whose book is entitled Tracing Our Country Marks, right? And so there's a number of different books that really focus on African cultural retention being the impetus for slave revolts. And so this is why you oftentimes see a pushback in terms of cultural programming being provided for African Americans. And secondly, I think it's very important that Elijah Muhammad once stated, and we know there's a number of issues people have with Elijah Muhammad, but one of the things I believe that he did right and he got right was he stated that if you're going to tell Black people to not emulate whites, you have to give them an alternative. And so I know a lot of Black people who get to a point of consciousness, right? If they get to this point of an digrescence, which is called, they have an encounter where they begin to question their perceived worldview of things from a Eurocentric lens or perspective. And they say, but I'm not going to celebrate, Christmas and Thanksgiving and so on and so forth. And they say, okay, great, right? We don't need to be the cultural children of the world. But then the solution is, okay, now what? You just sit home and do nothing? The kids just twiddle their thumbs during the holiday season? Absolutely not. And so so I think it's very important that we give an alternative. And I believe that alternative during the holiday season, particularly in December, is, of course, Kwanzaa. I can recall a time at my daughter's school where they had a non-denominational holiday mixer, right? They mentioned Christmas, they mentioned Hanukkah, they mentioned Chinese New Year, they mentioned Day of the Dead. But there was no Kwanzaa, and the school is 98% African American. So I said, oh, this can't happen. This is a problem. I spoke with the director of the school, who was a white woman. She said, oh, we can't celebrate Kwanzaa. I said, why not? I said, you know what? Everybody has a supervisor. I'm not even going to talk to you. I went to the superintendent, who's a black man. And of course, he said, yes, we can celebrate Kwanzaa. And so I made sure I was the one who implemented it. So I think it's very important that when we're engaging in Kwanzaa or any issue at a children's school, that we not only raise the issue, but we also provide the solution. Because as I talked about in an earlier video, earlier this year, when we're dealing with issues of race, issues of power, issues of discrimination, issues of proper education, it's one thing to raise the issue and highlight, but we don't want to simply be alarmists. We also want to make sure that what we're doing is we are the one providing the solution. Because if not, as I said when we talked about critical race theory, what would take place is white people would engage in interest convergence and make sure that the solution on its face is beneficial to us. But at the end of the day, it would benefit what? Them. So second, and I've always told my children this, that I was very intentional with how I wanted to raise them before they were born. So for me, it wasn't happenstantial, it wasn't circumstantial. Oh, I have kids now, what I'm going to do. I knew that I wanted to raise them very intentional and raise them to be black-minded, meaning I wanted them to think in a manner of what was in the best interest of black people, not only from a cultural standpoint or from a historical standpoint or from a political standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint, understanding that the major issue that black people are facing is the issue of power. That when we look at somebody dysfunctional, self-defeating, unhealthy, racially disempowering behavior that black people have, as part of that is rooted in the fact that we have an unhealthy concept of ourselves, society, and the world. And that, of course, is rooted in what Dr. Carter G. Woodson taught us many years ago in his seminal text, Miseducation of the Negro, which is what we have been miseducated and taught to work against our own best interests. And so, of course, I introduced my children to Kwanzaa at a very early age, along with a number of other African or African-inspired or Black-centered holidays, such as African Freedom Fighters Day. And for those of you who may not be aware, African Freedom Fighters Day is April 20th. And the reason why it is April 20th is because that is the day that many believe Queen Mother, esteemed ancestor, Harriet Tubman began her work on the Underground Railroad. African Liberation Day, which of course was created by Kwame Nkrumah to not only honor the fight for liberation that led to Ghana and many other sub-Saharan African nations being gaining their independence from colonialism, but also honoring the continued struggle against new forms, new and sophisticated forms of oppression, particularly neo-colonialism that was taking place on the African continent. But as a whole other conversation we can have about the IMF and the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, so on and so forth. But then last but not least, I felt that it was very important when I reviewed the principles of Kwanzaa. Of course, we know the principles are unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. I felt that these were principles that I wanted to teach to my children. That's the minimum set of values that we could use to restore our lives as a free, proud, and productive people. And so for me and my family, we make Kwanzaa something that is very fun. Of course, it's Black-centered, but we light the candle, and we have dinner, but we discuss the different principles. We talk about how have we been practicing this principle throughout the year? How does it benefit me personally? How does it benefit our community? And how does it benefit our race as a whole? There's even been times where in our family where we've had my son, because he's a teenager now, we have push-up contests, or my daughter, we have a public speaking contest where we get up and we do public speaking and things of that nature, just making it fun. Or we have a contest where who can make the best gift, right? Just making it fun, but really centering it in the principles and making sure we're doing what we can in the way that we can to make sure that we're strengthening not only ourselves as Black people, but our family and our community as well. And the reason why I think it's very important that we harp on and focus on the families, because we know that if we want to have a strong community, you have to first start with the most important institution, and that is the family. So for anyone who's arguing that this concept of the nuclear family is a Western invention, and particularly people on the left argue that is just something that is not historically accurate, right? We know that Ethiopia, for example, was a nation that was based on the nuclear family. Kemet, also known as Egypt, that was the case. When we look at the great Western Sudanic empires of Songhai, Mali, and of course Ghana, that was the case. Even though families might have been living, two or three families might have been living in one home or encampment, but that was the case. So we know that that's not something that is true. And we know that even coming out of the Holocaust of enslavement and going into, of course, unfortunately after Reconstruction, Jim Crowism and the Black codes and so on and so forth, that there was an emphasis on strong families, and that this breakdown in the family unit did not take place until after the 1960s, 60s with Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society, welfare reform programs that require that the man be removed from the household. So I think that's very important. But last but not least, I just want to state that the last reason I celebrate Kwanzaa, and one of the reasons is, of course, me implementing that, teaching it to my children, is because I believe Kwanzaa is a holiday that, if you actually do the research and you do the reading, teaches Black people to go from being a victim to a victor, right? When we talk about that great line of divine that includes, but doesn't exclude individuals such as Ida B. Wells, Holly Q. Brown, Malcolm X, Yaa Santawal, Queen Mother Moore, Mary McLeod Bethune, right? And the list goes on, as they say. What we do know is that they taught us to go from being victims to victors. They weren't individuals who were trying to weaponize being victims. They were individuals and leaders who believed in empowerment. And I believe that one of the resources that gives us that and what teaches us that are the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. So I think it's very important that we understand that. Once again, Kwanzaa is not a heroic holiday. It's not celebrating any individual person like a Malcolm X Day or Martin Luther King Day or Marcus Garvey Day would. And it's not a religious holiday. It's not associated with any religion. As I say, that many people have a belief that somehow, some shape, way, or form is associated with Islam or even African-inspired religions such as Rastafari, Santeria, or even about voodoo. But I think what's most important and what's really the basis of Kwanzaa are those 7 principles: unity, self-determination, collective working responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. And that the belief is that if we practice these principles, not just during these 7 days, but 24/7, 365, we can take control of our lives and restore ourselves to our traditional greatness. As someone who practices those 7 principles every day, as someone who teaches my children those principles and gives them examples of how they practice those principles every day, I can say that I know personally that Kwanzaa does have the ability of practicing those principles to help Black people to rediscover the best of what it means to be African and human, and of course restore ourselves to our traditional greatness. So once again, we want to thank everyone for checking out this video. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button, and please feel free to share.